In 1994, a Boston journalist left a city council meeting and never made it home. Her car was found parked neatly outside her apartment, keys still in the ignition. No sign of forced entry. No witnesses. No answers. The city moved on. But almost a decade later, under a street they were digging up for a subway extension, someone found a rotted canvas bag. Inside was a name most people had already forgotten. I hadn't, and I wasn't going to let them bury her twice. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Grace Holloway. I was 42 when Claire Walsh's name came back across my desk. At the time, I was working cold cases out of the Boston PD tucked behind a windowless bullpen in a building that still smelled like old copier ink and floor wax. I'd spent most of my career chasing ghosts, and I'd made peace with the fact that not every story gets a neat ending. But this one was different. I remember Claire's case from when I first joined the academy. Her face was in the papers for maybe a week. Freelance reporter, mother of 2. Then the headlines faded, and the story died the way most stories do, quietly without ceremony. They said she probably ran off, burned out, depressed. I never bought that. At the time, I was still living out in Brighton, just a short drive from my sister's place. Ava had gone missing less than a year after Claire. Different case, different circumstances, but the same silence. Same shrug from the department. That kind of silence sticks with you. It doesn't matter how many years pass. By the time I turned 40, I'd seen enough to know when something was wrong. And even back then, there was something about the way Claire's name came up, how quickly it disappeared. The city had this way of swallowing things that didn't fit. And Claire, she never fit the mold. She was loud, relentless, too smart to stay in her lane. That's why I remembered her. When her bag turned up in that trench under Tamont Street, the call came straight to my unit. Construction crew hit something, not a pipe, not debris. A waterlogged tote jammed between 2 slabs of concrete. Inside, a busted 35mm camera, rusted keys, and a press ID card no one had seen in nearly a decade. The foreman read the name out loud. Claire Walsh. And the moment I heard it, I felt something shift in my gut. Not surprise. Recognition. I went down to the site myself. Wind cut sharp off the harbor carried the smell of diesel and wet concrete. The trench was maybe 6 feet deep, nothing remarkable about it until you looked close. That bag didn't fall in. It had been forced into a space too narrow, wedged like someone meant to hide it. Not trash, not lost. Left. They handed me the press badge in a clear evidence bag. The photo was fogged plastic, warped, but the eyes were still hers. Clear. Stubborn. We sealed off the site and sent the contents straight to forensics. I stayed up most of that night reading the original missing person report. It was thin. No canvas around her apartment. No logs from the lot where her car was found. No formal crime scene. It was like the whole case had been boxed up and filed away before anyone even started looking. And then I noticed the date. March 12, 1994. The last night Claire Walsh was seen alive. The last time anyone remembered her walking out of a public meeting and vanishing without a trace. The next morning, I pulled the door closed to my office and sat there for a long time. Sometimes the quiet in a case is louder than anything else. And something told me this wasn't just a cold case. It was a warning. One that someone somewhere had worked very hard to keep buried. And then the call came in. One of the lab techs had gotten something off the film roll, grainy, damaged, but just clear enough to see 3 figures. And in the corner, a reflection. A partial face. Someone watching her. That's when I knew Claire hadn't disappeared. She'd been silenced. And someone out there still wanted her story dead. The image had been grainy, degraded by water and time, but clear enough to catch what mattered. 3 figures standing in some kind of underground garage, distant and unaware. One of them had the posture of command feet, planted wide shoulders, squared body, turned like he was mid-sentence. In the mirror, barely there but unmistakable, was the edge of a face. I didn't know who he was yet, but I knew I'd seen that kind of stillness before, the kind that doesn't worry about being watched because it thinks it owns the room. Forensics continued working on the film, but I didn't wait. I drove out to speak with the original investigator, Richard Mance, who'd long since retired to a quiet stretch of woods outside Worcester. He greeted me with a worn-out badge clipped to a sweatshirt and the kind of slow smile that let you know he'd seen better days. When I laid Claire's press badge on his kitchen table, his eyes didn't widen. He just sighed and leaned back in his chair like someone trying to recall an old scar. "I always thought she was dead," he said. "We weren't told to dig too deep. The orders came from higher up." He didn't name names, but I didn't need him to. I'd seen enough of these cases to recognize the pattern. Missed steps, lost paperwork. The quiet force of influence applied just enough to close a file without leaving fingerprints. Back at the precinct, I sat behind one of the media techs as he scrolled through each salvaged frame from Claire's camera. The developer had managed to recover more than expected, just enough to see context. A cinder block wall, some kind of industrial lighting overhead, a car, dark-colored older model parked at an angle, and then that mirror again. The reflection, clearer now, showed a man mid-40s, close-cropped hair, squared jaw, looking towards something off-camera. We ran it through facial match against archived city employee records from the early 90s. The name that came back froze the room: Reuben Voss, retired Boston PD. Internal Affairs had flagged his file years ago, sealed under early retirement due to unspecified misconduct. The timeline matched too well. Voss had gone quiet in '94, right around the time Claire disappeared. I didn't give him advance notice. I drove out to his place in Revere, a plain 2-story with bare landscaping and old blinds drawn tight. He opened the door without a word, eyes scanning my badge. He already knew. Inside the living room was sparse, one worn leather chair, a few military plaques on the wall, no signs of anyone else living there. He didn't offer coffee, just motioned for me to sit. "Shame what happened to her," he said. I kept my voice even. "You ever speak to her?" He nodded slowly. "Once. Brief thing at City Hall. She accused me of burying a housing report. I told her to get her facts straight. We never spoke again." He wasn't lying, not exactly, but something in his tone was rehearsed. When he stepped away to refill his coffee, I brushed his jacket sleeve with my hand. 3 hairs, clinging to the fleece like they were waiting for me. Back at headquarters, I walked those samples straight to the lab. 48 hours later, the match came back. Direct, root intact. The hair from Voss's jacket matched the one embedded in Claire's tote. Not transferred, not secondary. Primary contact. I signed the arrest warrant myself. Voss didn't resist. As I read him his rights, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You don't know what you're playing with." In the interview room, he folded his arms and didn't say a word until I laid the evidence bag on the table. "That was with Claire's things," I said. "We both know it." He didn't deny it, just stared down at his hands like they didn't belong to him anymore. Finally, he spoke. "She came at the wrong time. Wrong place. That's all." I said nothing. He kept going. "Me and Hurley. James Hurley. We were told to watch her. She was asking too many questions, digging in places that didn't want to be dug. We waited outside her apartment. She got back late, alone. Hurley hit her with a trank. I drove. My pen didn't stop moving. Where out by the harbor, old maintenance tunnel, not on any current maps, she woke up before morning, fought back, called us cowards, spat at me. I kept my tone level. And then he hesitated. The boss showed up. She was still alive when I left. I leaned in. The boss. Name him. He looked at the wall, then back at me. Ledden. Franklin Ledden. Councilman back then. Ran everything contracts cops press. I didn't respond. Just let the name hang in the air between us like a wire pulled too tight. You saw him kill her? I asked. No, Voss said. She was breathing when I walked away. But you'll testify. He nodded. But I want protection. Max security. Isolation. You don't know what this man can do. We'll make arrangements, I said. And we did. I called in every favor I had. Got Voss transferred overnight to a secure wing of Boston Correctional. No leaks, no access. The DA's office took my statement and began drafting the indictment under seal. The next 2 days moved like fog. I barely slept. I was still driving back from the courthouse when the call came in. Voss had been found unresponsive in his cell during morning rounds, dead before the medics arrived. The coroner let me observe the initial review. No external trauma, but a residue near the mouth foam, faint discoloration. Seizure, I asked. The coroner shook her head. Neurotoxin, synthetic, fast-acting, mimics epilepsy, leaves almost nothing behind. Poison, I said. She nodded. Someone got to him, quietly. Back at the facility, I reviewed the security logs. No visitors, no calls. But there was a gap in the camera feed between 1:47 and 2:06 a.m. Glitch, the IT guy told me. Happens with the old circuits. I stared at him until he looked away. That afternoon, I logged into the sealed indictment system to finish the paperwork and found my access revoked. It's being reviewed, the liaison said. State protocols. My request for an internal inquiry into Voss's death went nowhere. I was told to slow down, to follow the process. I hadn't been home in 2 days, and I wasn't sure I'd sleep if I went back. But I needed to clear my head. I took the stairs down to the underground garage behind the municipal annex. It was mostly empty quiet, save for one flickering bulb and the sound of my heels echoing off the concrete. Halfway to my car, I paused and reached into my purse like I'd forgotten my keys. That's when I saw it. A shadow, then a man. Smooth voice, calm. Detective Holloway, he said. You should have gone home. The pistol in his hand had the grip taped, but he was too slow. Boston PD, a voice shouted from the far side of the garage. 2 plainclothes officers stepped forward, guns drawn. Drop it now. The man froze. Let the weapon fall to the floor. As the cuffs clicked behind his back, I stepped forward and looked him in the eye. James Hurley. Should have stayed buried, he muttered, but I wasn't listening. My focus was already ahead. Because if Hurley was willing to kill to protect this, I had to ask what else had they buried, and how close was I to digging it up. He barely looked up when I stepped into the interrogation room. The cut on Hurley's temple was still raw from where he'd hit the ground in the garage, but he sat like he didn't feel it, shoulders loose, handcuffed, leaning back in his chair like we were about to have a casual talk. He watched me the way people watch someone walk across thin ice, not sure whether to laugh or start running. I didn't speak at first, just closed the door behind me, sat down and placed a recorder on the table. He tilted his head and gave a half smile. You're not dead, he said, like it was a joke we were both supposed to be in on. Good for you. I didn't bother responding. You botched 2 murders in 3 days, I said. Not your best streak. He shrugged. Voss didn't suffer. If that helps. I let the silence stretch. Hurley cracked his knuckles slowly, watching my face. You know what's funny? He said. I've seen a lot of people get in over their heads, cops reporters, people who think the truth's some kind of shield. But it never works out. They don't know when to stop. He leaned forward a little. You're not special detective. I kept my voice low. You killed Claire Walsh. He looked away. I didn't kill her. His voice was quieter now, almost automatic. But you were there, I said. That part he didn't argue. You poisoned Voss, I said. That's obstruction tampering murder. Doesn't matter how quiet it was, it still counts. He didn't speak for a while. Just stared down at the cuffs like he could will them open. Then he shifted. It was in the bottle cap. Water. He hesitated. He said he wouldn't feel anything. Who gave you the vial, I asked. Hurley's eyes stayed low. Ledden, he said. He knew Voss had talked. Said it was cleanup. Said he'd already signed the deal, there was no turning back. I leaned in. Tell me about the night Claire disappeared. Hurley exhaled through his nose. His voice was steady, but something in him had gone flat. She said she had files, names, enough to put people away. Said if she vanished, they'd come out. Did they? I asked. We never found anything. Then she hid them good, he said, because we turned that apartment upside down. Nothing, no drive, no notes, just a husband who thought she was working late. Where did you take her? I asked. Old runoff tunnel near Dock 9, he said. Abandoned storm chamber. She fought like hell on the way there. Kicked out a taillight. He laughed once, short and bitter. She called me a coward. Said I'd sell my soul for a paycheck. I told her she didn't know how the city worked. He paused. And then Ledden showed up. What happened next? He swallowed hard. She still wouldn't say where the files were. He kept asking. Got loud. Then real quiet. Said it had to look like she just vanished. Told me to get the tarp. We wrapped her up, carried her down through the drainage hatch, and buried her under construction scrap. He wiped at his nose with the shoulder of his shirt. It wasn't supposed to go that far. But it did, I said. And she wasn't the only one. Hurley nodded slowly. Luis Ortiz, housing inspector, had a report ready to file on kickbacks through the city council. Ledden called it preemptive. We lit his place up, called it electrical. He kept going. Elias Finch, law clerk, helped Claire pull records on dummy companies tied to city projects. Shot in a robbery. Nothing taken. And Monique Day, nurse who worked the clinic near one of the developments. She flagged dosage discrepancies in patient files, people who were never seen prescriptions that didn't match. She vanished, walking home. No witnesses, no report filed. I wrote it all down, my pen moving without stopping. You're going to make a full statement, I said. Every name, every timeline, every detail. And if even one piece doesn't line up with what we find, you'll be carrying all of it. Hurley didn't argue, just nodded once. That afternoon, I assembled a cold case field team and pulled the original utility maps for the harbor district. We found the old service station tucked behind Pier 12 chain-link fence, half-rusted weeds crawling through cracked concrete. The building was barely standing, windows punched out signage warned of nothing. It took less than an hour with the dogs. They stopped near the far corner by a rusted storm grate buried under years of sand and leaves. The shaft below was narrow, just wide enough for one person. Smelled like salt rot and motor oil. We lowered lights first, then dug. About 2 feet down, we hit tarp, thick plastic, knotted and heavy. Inside were human remains, curled tight like someone had tried to fit her into the smallest space possible. We found a leather belt, a rusted watch, what was left of a lanyard. The forensic team took her to Quincy for full processing. Dental matched within 36 hours. It was her, Claire Walsh. The case was no longer missing. It was homicide. But something about it wouldn't settle. The weight of it didn't lift. I sat in my car after the call came through rain on the windshield, just watching the courthouse lights flicker against the pavement. It should have felt like resolution. But it didn't. Not yet. Back at the lab, a tech flagged something in the final sweep. Epithelial tissue beneath Claire's fingernails. Right hand, protected by the way her fingers had curled. Still viable, still hers. The DNA profile came through that night. There was no mistaking it. Franklin Ledden. I remembered the meeting I'd had with him weeks earlier, the casual way he'd offered me coffee, the slight scar on his forearm where a cluster of marks ran just below the cuff of his shirt. She'd scratched him. She had fought, and she'd left her proof in the only place they couldn't clean. I folded the report, placed it in the file, and called the DA's office. Because now it wasn't just what Voss said or what Hurley confessed. Claire had named her killer. Quietly. Completely. And we were finally ready to listen. It wasn't the breakthrough that kept me up at night. It was the silence that followed. Once the DNA came back, once we knew Claire had scratched Franklin, Ledden left him marked. It felt like the kind of evidence that should move things forward. But the pace didn't quicken. It slowed. Doors that had been half open eased shut again. People I'd worked with for years stopped returning calls. The DA's office sat on the indictment longer than they should have. One of the younger assistants finally admitted there'd been a meeting higher up, someone from the state liaison's office reviewing jurisdiction. Standard procedure, she said, eyes dropping as soon as the words left her mouth. I knew better. I'd seen what that kind of stalling meant. It wasn't about evidence. It was about weight, about whose name was written too many places for the system to handle cleanly. I started keeping odd hours, took my meals at my desk, ran my own errands for chain of custody. If I left anything on someone else's desk, it didn't come back the same. Some nights I'd fall asleep in the break room, wake up stiff, still in yesterday's clothes, files open in front of me like I'd been waiting for something to change on their own. The further I went, the quieter it got. I was moving towards something heavy, and I could feel it pushing back. The day we buried Claire's case file under a sealed warrant, I found myself rereading her notes. Pages salvaged from that mold-softened notepad, parts of the old journal Thomas had given me, names scribbled in the margins of agendas she'd taken from council meetings. I traced them again and again, Ortiz Finch Day, until I didn't see the ink anymore. I saw faces, the outlines of people who had risked everything, and were now just names in systems that no one ever searched. I hadn't gone home in 3 nights when I finally stepped outside for air. Late. The city was humming low. Somewhere past midnight, the streets empty enough to hear your own thoughts. I parked in the annex garage without thinking, keys and handbag on my shoulder. I didn't see him at first, just heard the step. Not hurried. Measured. He came around the van slow, one hand raised slightly, not in surrender, not in panic. Just holding a pistol with tape around the grip as if it had been used before. "Detective Holloway," he said. His voice was calm, almost familiar. "You should have gone home." The weight of the gun was real, but what froze me wasn't fear. It was recognition. I knew who he was. Hurley. I'd seen the reflection, I'd heard Voss say the name, and now he was standing 3 feet from me like none of that mattered. The rest happened fast. Plainclothes backup had trailed me protocol after Voss's death. 2 officers came from opposite ends of the lot, guns raised, voices sharp. "Drop it! Now!" Hurley didn't argue, just let the weapon fall to the concrete and stared at me as they cuffed him. "Should have stayed buried," he said, "not to them. To me." I interviewed him myself. Downstairs. No windows. The kind of room that pulls the truth out slow. He didn't start defensive. Didn't beg. Just settled into the chair like a man who'd already said goodbye to the world and wasn't trying to make peace with it. "You're not the first," he told me, "but you're the loudest. You made noise." I asked him again about Claire. Not the report this time. Just face to face. And he talked. Not because he felt guilt, but because it no longer made a difference. He walked me through it like a route he knew by heart. Her apartment, the taillight she kicked, the tunnel, the tarp. He didn't flinch at the details, but when I asked why someone like him followed someone like Ledden, he paused. Because it was already happening, he said. Before me. Before her. He just knew how to work the cracks. He didn't build the machine, detective. He ran it better than the others. He described how Ledden gave orders without needing to say the words. How code enforcement would forget a complaint. How someone on zoning would lose a file. How a death would look like a heart attack, a robbery, a simple accident. I remember sitting across from him, pen in hand, and thinking not about Claire, but about Ava, my sister, missing since '95. No body, no clear event, just gone. 1 week after she'd written a complaint letter to a local contractor about unsafe construction near her school. I had told myself it wasn't connected for 20 years, but now I didn't know. After the interview, I typed the report myself. No dictation, no help. I didn't trust anyone else with the sequence. And when I finished, I sat alone in the archive room reading every page of the internal audit on Ledden's council projects between 1992 and 1996. Page after page of redacted language funding discrepancies and one memo that had been misfiled tucked under Parks and Rec by mistake. A name I hadn't seen before. Travis Kimbrell, independent contractor, licensed site planner. Issued a single permit review for the Pier 12 flood chamber in April of '94, right after Claire disappeared. And then nothing. No further jobs, no active license. I flagged it immediately, cross-checked with the project photos from the harbor recovery site. The slab we dug up had the same initials etched in the corner. Kimbrell had been there, at the chamber, the same month Claire was buried. I pushed the file across my desk, sat back in the chair, and stared at the ceiling. The system hadn't just failed Claire. It had helped erase her. Quietly, thoroughly. But it hadn't worked. Because a busted camera, a line of ink, a scar on a man's arm. They had all carried her name farther than they meant to. And now someone else's name had surfaced. Someone I needed to find before he disappeared too. I pulled the permit file that night quietly without logging the request through the usual channels. Just a paper copy scanned from a warehouse archive out in Everett, stamped and stapled with a coffee ring in the corner like it had sat untouched for years. Travis Kimbrell, one-time site planner, age listed as 34 at the time of submission. No active license after 1994. His name wasn't on any of the city's standard payroll rolls or inspection records, not before, not after. Just one appearance linked to a structural review of the Pier 12 runoff site, the same location where Claire had been buried. I cross-referenced the signature against public bid logs from that fiscal quarter. It wasn't there, which meant either the job was subcontracted through a shell company or he'd been brought in under the table. Either way, it was a ghost job. The kind no one was meant to ask about. The address listed on the form was a South Medford rental. I drove out the next morning. The street had changed since the '90s, new sidewalks, 2 more traffic lights at Dunkin', where the old pharmacy used to be, but the house was still there. Pale blue siding front porch sagging just enough to suggest age but not neglect. A woman answered the door, early 60s maybe, said she'd bought the place in 2001. She didn't recognize the name Kimbrell, said the previous owner had passed no forwarding information. I thanked her, stepped off the porch, and sat in my car for a long minute with the engine off. That was how this case moved now. Quiet, unannounced, every inch earned. Most days I wasn't sure whether I was chasing a man or a shadow, but I kept going. I found a listing through the Department of Public Health. Kimbrell had applied for a demolition permit 3 years after Claire disappeared. It was the last official act in his name. The job was approved, carried out, and then his record stopped cold. No new license, no change of address, no death certificate. He hadn't just disappeared. He'd been removed. Back at the precinct, I pulled the evidence box from Claire's car one more time. Most of the items were routine gum wrappers, parking stubs, receipts, but one of the receipts caught my eye. A supply store in Dorchester. March 10th, 1994. 2 days before she vanished. The item was vague drafting copies, blueprint scans. I drove out to the print shop. It was still in business, still run by the same family. The owner, a man in his late 70s, remembered Claire. She was polite, he said. Focused, real particular about how she wanted things labeled. I asked if any of the scans still existed. He shook his head but reached below the counter and pulled out an old binder. We used to keep carbon slips from jobs back then, just in case. I flipped through page by page, and there it was, Claire's name. A job tag with her initials and a note T. Kimbrel storm layout, revised elevations. I didn't say much. Just thanked him and walked out into the parking lot, the wind pressing cold against the side of my face. Something about it clicked in that moment, something I hadn't been looking for. Claire hadn't just been digging into public records. She had found a name, linked it to a structure, and paid to have its layout documented. She was trying to map the system, and she had written that name down in more than one place. I called Thomas Walsh that evening. He didn't ask why I was reaching out. Just invited me over like he knew this part would come. His living room was dim, one-floor lamp on the kids' backpacks, still slouched against the wall where they'd dropped them after school. Thomas handed me a file folder he'd been keeping in the back of a locked cabinet notes Claire had printed before she disappeared. A few were water-damaged, but most were intact, and one page stood out. A grid of names, most crossed out in ink. One circled twice T. Kimbrel, storm contractor, check permit route. She told me once Thomas said voice low that there were people getting paid to move things around underground lines, water flow maps. Said whole sections of the city were being misreported. He paused. I didn't understand half of what she meant. But I remember that name. I asked if Claire had ever mentioned hiding anything, notes, files, anything that could be recovered. He hesitated, then walked me down the hall. The closet at the end of the corridor had a loose baseboard. Behind it, wrapped in waxed paper and taped tight with masking tape, was a small envelope. Inside, one microcassette. No label, no date, just a single word written in marker. Leaden. I didn't play it at the house. I thanked him, told him I'd follow up if anything else came up, and drove back to the precinct with the envelope on the passenger seat beside me like it might vanish if I blinked too long. The audio was rough, hiss and static in parts, but the voice was hers, Claire's. Calm, focused. She was narrating names, dates, patterns of movement, mentions of building permits, backdoor approvals. Kimbrel Leaden. A specific entry caught my attention, March 9th, 1994. Meeting scheduled with Leaden, front to front. No intermediaries. If I'm right, he'll either shut it down or make his move. Either way, this ends soon. That was 2 days before she disappeared. I sat there alone in the darkened media room, listening to her words repeat in my head. She knew. She saw it coming, and she tried to leave a trail even if no one was listening at the time. I pressed pause, walked out into the hallway. The precinct felt empty, even though I knew people were still working behind closed doors. Everything about this case was heavy. The kind of weight that clings to your coat long after you hang it up. But now we had a voice, a name, a recording, and for the first time something that couldn't be explained away. The past wasn't just talking. It was about to testify. The air out by the docks carried a different kind of quiet. Not the silence you get in a church or a courtroom, but the kind that hangs over places left behind. Weeds pushing through fractured concrete, old signage, rusted to the point of unreadable, a chain-link fence that sagged where salt air had eaten the metal thin. The runoff tunnel behind Pier 12 hadn't been on any updated city plans since the late 80s. No one worked out there anymore. No one had reason to. But Hurley's statement hadn't wavered, and Claire's recording confirmed it. This was where they took her. This was where they buried the truth. I stood at the edge of the perimeter with my coat drawn tight against the wind. Forensics had already marked out a search grid based on the original storm chamber footprint. The dogs had hit on something near the southeast corner, right beneath a collapsed section of retaining wall. That's where we started digging. It took hours. Shovels first, then hand tools as we worked beneath the slab. Clay and broken brick gave way to compacted earth. Someone had laid scrap metal on top, sheeting rebar, even a broken conduit pipe, like they were trying to weigh the ground down, keep it from ever surfacing. When the edge of the tarp appeared, I stepped back and let the team move slow. Every fold was treated like a live wire. The plastic had stained dark with age, the rope knotted tight like it had been rushed but deliberate. And when they pulled it clear, the bundle came up heavy. She was curled inward, the remains folded tight to fit the space. Clothing fibers still clung to parts of the frame. A rusted wristwatch was still looped around bone. The belt had come apart in the center leather, worn to dust where it had rested under pressure. And beside it, all flattened and decayed but still readable, was a laminated lanyard tag. The name had peeled, but the outline of the press badge was unmistakable. We took her back to Quincy. Let the medical examiner handle it the right way. I didn't stay for the autopsy. I sat with Thomas instead. I didn't want to tell him over the phone. His kids were home from school, and I could see from the window they already knew something was different by the way he answered the door. We sat at the table in the same kitchen where Claire had once written notes at midnight, where she'd stayed up long after her family had gone to bed trying to make sense of the numbers. "I never stopped believing she didn't leave us," he said, fingers locked together so tight the knuckles had gone pale. "But I didn't think we'd ever find her. Not after all this time." He looked at the photo I brought, just the watch on a clean linen tray. "I gave her that for her 28th, he said, then nodded. "You'll get what you need for DNA." The lab confirmed it within 2 days. They didn't need much, and even though we already knew there was something about having it on paper that made it real in a way the badge or the tarp hadn't, it wasn't a theory anymore. It was Claire. But that still wasn't the end. Back at the lab, one of the forensic techs, Marcus Sharp Kid, kept his desk neater than anyone I've ever seen, called me down personally. He was holding the evidence envelope like it was glass. "There's something under the fingernails," he said. "Right hand third digit. Looks like she got in one last shot." We ran the sample. It was degraded but viable. Partial epithelial. Enough to confirm a profile. I already knew who it was before the report hit the screen. Franklin Ledden. His DNA under her nail. That mark I'd seen on his forearm the first time we met, a trio of shallow scars, faint but there. She'd gotten one last swing in. I sat there staring at the result. Not thinking, just still. That was the moment it shifted. Not just for the case, but for me. Because it meant she'd seen him. Fought him. She didn't just vanish into the dark, she resisted. I took the report straight to the district attorney. No emails, no assistance. Just walked it in and waited while they read. There was no more ambiguity, no more space to defer. We had Hurley's confession, the site recovery, the original permit links, and now the biological tie to Ledden. I made it clear we weren't waiting, but I still didn't trust the system to carry it across the finish line alone. So I made a second call. Aiden Carrion, field supervisor with the Bureau. He and I had worked a trafficking case years earlier, one that unraveled fast because someone waited too long to act. I told him what we had. I told him what we needed. No leaks, no whispers, just bodies on the ground and cuffs at the ready. He said, "Tell me where." The night of the arrest, the Renaissance Hotel ballroom was packed. Campaign donors, city officials. Ledden was at the front, tux, pressed drink in hand, shaking someone's palm, while a jazz quartet played near the stage. I waited by the entryway with plainclothes agents stationed at every exit. When the mayor raised a glass for a photo op, I walked across the carpet like I was just another guest arriving late. "Senator Ledden," I said, voice steady. He turned, polite smile already on his face. "Detective Holloway. What a surprise." I showed him the warrant. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of homicide." The room didn't make a sound. The cameras flashed. His expression flickered, first surprise, then calculation. He straightened his jacket like he still had control. But when the agents moved in, when the cuffs clicked shut, he didn't say a word. At the precinct, seated across from me again, he leaned back in the chair and gave the same half-smile. "This is all a mistake," he said. "A smear. I hope you realize how ridiculous this will look by the end." I didn't respond. I laid down the photos one by one. The tarp, the watch, the skeletal remains. And finally the lab report, her DNA. His DNA, the match. "You gave the order," I said. "You were there. She scratched you, didn't she?" He looked down at his arm, then back at me, then gave a small, tired nod. "She had names," he said. "Files. It would have ended everything. I told them to get her talking. When she wouldn't, I told them to handle it. He didn't say kill. Never did. But he didn't deny it either. He went quiet after that. Let the silence do the rest. And I let it. Because we weren't finished yet. We still had to take it to court. Still had to prove what the city had spent decades trying not to see. But we weren't chasing shadows anymore. We were standing in the light. He sat at the end of the table like he still had power. Shoulders relaxed, one arm draped over the back of the chair, the kind of posture you see in people who are used to being listened to. But this time, there wasn't a microphone on his lapel or a reporter in the room. Just me, the thick folder in front of us, and the quiet sound of a fan clicking somewhere behind the ceiling tiles. He didn't speak first. He didn't have to. I laid out each page slowly. The photos of Claire's remains, the autopsy report, the DNA match beneath her fingernail, the transcript of Hurley's sworn statement, and finally the permit trail that placed a shell contractor at the harbor site the same week Claire vanished. Ledden's eyes didn't flicker. He just sat there and watched me like he thought he might still talk his way out of it. "You gave the order," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You showed up at that tunnel. You were there when she fought back." His jaw tightened, once barely visible. Then he exhaled. "She wasn't supposed to die," he said, like it made a difference. "It got out of hand." He paused. Let the weight of that phrase hang in the air. She had documents' names. I told Hurley to get the files, shut it down quietly. She was smart. Too smart. She said if anything happened to her, it would all come out. He looked down at the table, and I believed her. He gave the rest up in pieces. Not all at once. He never said the word murder, but he didn't deny it. Said Claire had been digging through housing grants, tracking inflated invoices tied to redevelopment contracts. She'd traced them to donors connected to his campaign. At first, he'd tried to stall her, scheduled a meeting, made it seem like he was cooperating. But she kept pushing. She wouldn't stop, he said, even after the threats, even after the phone calls. She wanted to see it burn. He named 2 more victims without being asked. Luis Ortiz, the housing inspector, was preparing to file a report to the State Ethics Board. Ledden called it a fire hazard and sent Hurley. Elias Finch, the legal clerk, had helped Claire identify ownership records tied to shell companies. Ledden said they staged a mugging. Nothing stolen. Shot once in the chest. I asked him about the nurse Monique Day. He nodded. Said she flagged fake patient records being used to justify medical reimbursements for workers who didn't exist. She vanished on her walk home. Never made it past the commuter lot. They made it look like she skipped town. Every story had the same pattern. Someone found something, asked too many questions, and the machine shifted just enough to erase them. Ledden never touched the scenes himself, but his fingerprints were on all of it. When I asked if he'd testify to the grand jury, he hesitated, then nodded once. "I'll give you what I know, but I want isolation. No general population, no leaks." He knew what was waiting for him on the inside. So did I. Within 48 hours, we had what we needed. Hurley's testimony had already been recorded. Ledden's confession confirmed the chain of events and named specific players tied to obstruction and conspiracy. We secured a sealed indictment, and the names kept coming. A city zoning official who falsified permit approvals, a former chief of staff who laundered campaign donations through real estate firms, 3 contractors who supplied ghost invoices for work never completed. The indictments were issued one by one, quietly, then publicly. The courtroom filled before the trial even began. Reporters packed the back row. Retired city workers sat near the front, folded programs clutched tight in their hands. Grace Holloway, Cold Case Unit, testified on day 2. I watched the jury the whole time. No reactions, just eyes tracking from page to page. When Thomas Walsh took the stand, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke about the night Claire disappeared. About how he sat in the living room waiting, assuming traffic, assuming a last-minute call. How he'd gone to the police station the next morning and was told to file a missing person report, then wait. How no one followed up. The prosecutor, Elena Rhodes, didn't lean on theatrics. She walked the jury through the case like she was laying out cinder blocks, one on top of the other. Timeline, forensics, witnesses, audio recording, chain of custody. Every piece connected. No room for doubt. The medical examiner reviewed the injuries, multiple fractures, impact trauma to the face, consistent with blunt force. Defensive wounds to the hands. She fought, he said. Even in the final moments, she fought. The recording from Claire's microcassette was played in full. The room was silent the entire time. You could hear the static rise and fall between her words, her voice calm, focused, not afraid, resigned, and determined. She named names. She mapped the system. She described what would happen if she didn't come home. And every word matched what we'd uncovered. Hurley entered under full escort, wearing a jumpsuit, wrists cuffed at his sides. He answered questions plainly, no embellishment. Senator Ledden gave the order, he said. Said we had to make it look like she just disappeared. Said if the press caught wind of her investigation, it would ruin everything. He named every location, every victim, every method. Voss didn't want to keep going, he added. Said we'd crossed the line. That's when the poison showed up. In closing, Rhodes didn't speak about corruption. She spoke about Claire. About the kind of woman who stays up after the house is asleep, scribbling notes no one else would ever read. About what it means to do the right thing when it's the hard thing. She was a reporter, Rhodes said, a mother, a citizen, and for that, for doing what we ask of every good person in a working society, she paid the price we're supposed to protect her from. The verdict came back in less than 3 hours. Guilty. On all counts. Conspiracy, obstruction, first-degree murder. Ledden didn't argue, didn't look up, just sat there still like he finally understood what it meant to be powerless. As the judge read the sentence, life without the possibility of parole, I looked at Thomas. He wasn't crying. He wasn't smiling. Just sitting still, one hand resting over the other the way people do when something heavy finally lets go of them. But it's not freedom, just stillness. The trial ended. But the damage had already echoed through 3 decades of silence. And part of me knew this wasn't over. Not really. Not for the families. Not for the others who'd been told to stop asking questions. We had the truth now. But what we'd lost to get here, that was something no sentence could give back. And yet, something else lingered. in the back of my mind, in the paper trail we hadn't followed yet. A final connection that didn't belong to Claire. A name I'd seen once in passing buried in an old zoning record. A name I hadn't said out loud in years. Ava. My sister. 1995. Different year, different case. But the same silence. The same system. And suddenly I wasn't sure her story had ended either. The case was closed on paper. The indictments were filed, sentences handed down, evidence catalogued. But in the weeks that followed the trial, I found myself waking up around 4:00 a.m. most mornings, heart racing, thoughts loud. I'd been with Boston PD long enough to know that when your gut keeps turning over something that's done, it usually means it's not. Not really. I kept thinking about Claire's notes about the way she'd boxed her findings by category. Most of the sections were marked with city department initials or dates, but one stood out. Just a name written in blue ink and underlined twice Ava. No surname, no title, just that. I told myself it could have been a coincidence. Ava's a common name. Maybe Claire had interviewed someone by that name years earlier, or it was shorthand for something else. But it wasn't. I knew it. My sister disappeared in 1995. Different borough, different circumstance. But the same feel. The same missing pages in the report. The same silence from upstairs. Back then I hadn't had the rank or reach to push the investigation further. After a year they closed it out with no leads. Suspicious but unresolved. The phrasing they use when they want to clear a file without drawing attention. I started digging again. This time with full access and no one above me pulling strings. I pulled Ava's case file and reread every page. Time-stamped the last outgoing calls, interview logs, photographs from her apartment. Then I did the same with Claire's evidence box. They'd never met. No crossover in their circles, no common workplaces, nothing obvious. But when I laid out the two timelines side by side, one date stood out. June 12, 1994. Ava logged a 17-minute phone call to an unlisted number registered to a community development board. That same day, Claire had attended a zoning hearing where she requested access to housing permits involving the Dockland conversion project. One of the permits from that meeting was signed by someone named R. Beckett. I'd seen that name before. It appeared briefly on a consulting invoice filed under a defunct non-profit, one that had been red-flagged in the background of the trial. Beckett had never been indicted, never formally accused, but he'd been present. And in 1995, he vanished too. No forwarding address, no exit statement, just stopped showing up to meetings. I tracked down a former assistant who'd worked with the board in the early 90s. She was retired now, living up in Gloucester. I didn't tell her who I was at first, just asked if she remembered Ava or Claire. She remembered both. Said Ava had been working part-time at a neighborhood outreach center that summer, clerical stuff, mostly data entry calls. She remembered Ava staying late one week to help refile grant applications that had come in mixed up. She found something weird, the woman said. Came into my office with a file and said the math didn't add up. I told her not to worry about it, but she looked rattled. I asked if she knew what the file was tied to. She didn't. Said it had to do with property valuations, low-income development grants. Sounded familiar. Sounded like the start of the same pattern. I called in a quiet favor from someone at the Registry of Deeds. Asked them to pull every property transaction tied to the Dockland site from 1993 to 1996. Took 3 days to get it all scanned and sorted. One name showed up multiple times, GDN Holdings. I ran it. No real employees. No business license in state. A shell just like the ones Claire had flagged. But this one had a P.O. box linked to a tenant services office in Southie. The address matched a building that had since been turned into loft apartments. I went by in person. The mailroom manager was kind enough to let me look through some of the archived boxes from the 90s. Deep in one of them, I found a folded memo with city letterhead. It was a vendor contract renewal signed and dated July 1995. Name at the bottom, Ava Holloway. I froze. Not because I doubted it. I'd seen her handwriting 1,000 times. Grocery lists, birthday cards, sticky notes she'd leave on my desk when I was in training. It was hers. It had been there the whole time, tucked inside a box no one bothered to open. I brought it back to the station and placed it next to Claire's last memo. Same pen type, same paper stock, even the same municipal watermark. 2 women who were never supposed to cross paths, both pulled the same thread. Both vanished for it. I walked into the captain's office and placed the files on his desk. "I'm reopening Ava's case," I said. He nodded once. Didn't ask why, just said, "You'll need a clean clearance form and someone to run interference if this goes above your pay grade." I told him it already had. In the days that followed, I requested sealed records from the city archives, files that hadn't been touched in over 2 decades. Most of them had missing pages, gaps in the indexing. Someone had stripped out information years ago and they'd done it quietly, but not perfectly. One of the scanned records showed a contractor billing Sheet 3 entries listed under a subcontractor named Horizon East Logistics. The contact on record was someone named Voss Coulter, the same Voss Hurley had named in his testimony, the one who'd started to pull away just before the poison. His name was there tied to Ava's project. I sat at my desk that night long after everyone else had gone home. The hum of the overhead light, the low murmur of a printer spooling somewhere behind the wall, the soft knock of shoes on tile outside my door. And in the center of it all, that single copy of Ava's memo. The date, the signature, the echo of something unfinished. I knew what I had to do. Tomorrow I'd drive north to the town where Hurley said Voss had disappeared to. A place no one had checked since the 90s. No official records, no trace on digital. But I knew the address. Claire had circled it once on a page I almost threw out. The ink had bled slightly from moisture, maybe rain, maybe sweat. I wasn't doing this as a cop anymore. This was personal. The file might be stamped solved now, but the system that took Ava, that part hadn't died with Leaden. It was still breathing, somewhere out there, waiting for people like her, and people like Claire. And it wasn't going to get the last word. Not this time. I found Voss in a hospital outside Waterville. He wasn't registered under his real name, and he wasn't conscious. The administrator called me after finding my card tucked into an old notebook that had been dropped off with him. They said he'd been brought in by a woman who didn't leave a name, just left a piece of paper with the word Claire written across the top. He'd collapsed in the parking lot of a church food pantry 3 days earlier, dehydrated, shaking, and mumbling something about a ledger. They thought it might have been drug-related, but no substances showed up in the tox screen. It wasn't drugs. It was fear, and maybe guilt. He never fully came back to himself. He mumbled in pieces, street names, city departments, and 2 names, Ava and Claire, over and over again like a prayer or a penance. I sat with him a few times before they moved him to long-term care. He didn't know me, or if he did, he didn't let on. But on the last day I visited, I said, "I know what you did, and I know why you tried to fix it." His eyes didn't move, but one tear ran down the left side of his cheek. The DA declined to reopen Ava's case. Said the evidence was circumstantial and the statute too far gone. But they agreed to issue an amended report, one that acknowledged she likely died as a result of exposure connected to city corruption. It wasn't justice, but it was truth. And in this world, sometimes that's the most we get. Claire's name was formally cleared, and her final report was archived into the public record where it should have been all along. I spoke at the dedication they held for her downtown, a bench facing the park where she used to eat lunch most days. I said she didn't die chasing a story. She died making sure we'd never stop asking questions. And that matters. I brought Ava's last signed memo to her mother a few weeks later. She still lived in the same 2-story duplex where we'd grown up. Her hands shook when she held it. Not from age, from recognition. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my girl's hand." We didn't talk much after that, just sat on the porch while the sun went down. It was enough. As for me, I'm still on the job, still chasing threads that most folks have long forgotten. Not because I expect to fix everything I don't, but because I've learned that silence is its own kind of violence, and records don't stay buried on their own. People put them there. And sometimes people like Claire give their lives to pull them back out. It's strange the things that stay with you. The way Ava used to laugh through her nose when she read something funny. The smell of ink on Claire's reports. The echo of shoes in a hall that should have been empty. I carry those with me. I always will. If this story stayed with you, maybe sit with it a little longer. Share it if you want. Or just remember the names. Ava Holloway. Claire Morgan. 2 women who were never supposed to matter this much, but who did. Quietly, completely, and forever.